What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the workshop. I hope you're all doing awesome. We are back working on the giant edge sander. In the first episode, we completed what I'm calling phase one, and that was basically just getting it together. Let's just make it run, see everything operate before we continue. We're going to start in today on phase two, which is going to be to create some sort of a work platform here to support your workpiece. Otherwise, you're going to have to hold on to it. It's going to be really awkward. We need some sort of a work table. So that's what we're going to work on. I'm Jeff. You're watching Home Built Workshop. To build a work table to support our piece, the easiest method that came to mind was just build up some sort of a framework, put a flat top on there, and basically we're done. And while that would work great, as I thought about that a little bit more, there's an issue that came up that I thought that I might want to address. Let's say that we have a fixed height table, and anytime we're sanding something, it's always going to be basically at that height. Well, that's going to wear the belt out right in that location. Let's just say, for instance, we're sanding a lot of 3/4 inch thick stuff that's going to wear out just a thin sliver of this 8-inch wide belt. I want to have the ability to adjust the height of this work table so that we can use the entire belt. If we're sanding something thin, we don't always have to sand in the same spot. We can change the height. I think that's going to help us get better use of these giant belts. I don't want to have to buy a new one just because I wore out one little strip. That could get expensive pretty quick. So the one thing that I decided on was that I want this platform to be adjustable, and I think I got it figured out. I want to mount the table on some linear rail. By having these bearings on here, it'll slide up and down really nice. We'll have some sort of a hand crank in the center to actually adjust the height. And since everything's running on the rails will help keep everything from racking back and forth, keep it nice and even, and allow it to smoothly raise and lower. To mount the bearings, I want to use some 1/4 inch flat bar. This will eventually get bolted solid to the table of the machine. And basically, I want to mount the bearings right around this area. By having it mounted to this plate, it's going to keep everything nice and flat. Then when the plate gets bolted to the side of the machine, the bearings will be fixed in this shaft. We'll be able to slide up and down. We'll have the tabletop connected up here, which is a little bit unconventional. It's not typically how you use these. Usually you'll mount something here so that it can slide back and forth. But in this application, I'm going to have the bearing blocks fixed and the shaft will be able to move. One thing that'll make this kind of nice is these bearing blocks already have screw holes. So all I really need to do is lay everything out on this flat bar. We can clamp them in place and I can mark all those holes. I'm going to try to leave them on this shaft while I'm doing all of that alignment. That way, there's no chance that they can get skewed. The shaft will keep everything in alignment while we mark and get the holes drilled. These marks are for where I'm going to drill the mounting holes to mount this plate. The bearings will get mounted inside those marks. We'll have to add another piece of square tube to the frame once we can get the welder back out, do some welding. But for now, I just need some reference lines to know where the square tubes are going to go. The center punch I'm using is a Starrett 48-B. This thing is a beast for making marks in metal. A lot of times I'll use this little automatic center punch for marking wood and that sort of thing. This Starrett has a way stronger punch and it's a hardened steel tip. I don't think this little guy here is a hardened steel tip. This one does work great for wood, but for making marks in metal, this Starrett is awesome. To the drill press we go. That's the last mounting hole drilled. Now we can line up the bearing blocks on these and get those holes marked. I'm going to clamp these blocks in place so that they can't move around while I mark the hole locations. Now I'll just measure, make sure the blocks are centered up on this piece of flat bar, trying to keep everything as square as possible. I don't have any sort of fixture table or anything like that, so I'm just relying off measurements as best I can. I'm going to transfer these hole locations in the bearing blocks to the flat bar using a transfer punch that's the exact size that needs to be for this hole. That way the hole location will be perfect because I plan on tapping this flat bar so that I can screw the bolts right into this piece. And now we have perfectly marked holes that exactly match these bearing blocks. And now it's back to the drill press to drill out these mounting holes. Once they're all drilled, I'm going to tap these for a 12/24 screw. As I was tapping these, I realized I really like the sound that a tap makes when you're tapping metal. So here's a little bit of metal tapping ASMR. That's the last hole. All tapped. Now, in theory, we should be able to lay those bearing blocks back on here and screw everything down. Now, for some reason, it's at this step that I ran into a bit of a problem, and I don't know why. Maybe you guys can help me understand this. I tapped these holes for a 12/24 screw because that's the closest size outside of a metric that fit the holes that are already in these bearing blocks. Once I got these tapped, I checked the screws that I have on hand because I have a collection of different sizes of screws, 832, 1032, 12/24, and 32, but I didn't have anything long enough. So I thought, well, I'll just run to the hardware store and grab some. It turns out most hardware stores, for some reason, don't carry 12/24 or even 12/32. Why is this? The closest hardware store to me had nothing. Their collection went from 832, 1032, right to 1/4-20. Totally skipped over every single 12/24 or even 12/32. So I had to drive into town and I went to another place, one of the big box stores, where they have basically a whole aisle full of drawers you can pull out and sort through different pieces of hardware. They too did not have any 12/24 or 32. Finally, I found the screws that I need at my local Ace Hardware. They have a really nice selection of screws, and they actually had some 12/24s. They had the length that I need there, except they were 4 screws short for the steel ones, so I picked up a few of the same size in brass. Now this is a lot softer material. It's going to work fine for now, and my intention is to get some more of the right size and swap these brass ones out later. Although most likely these will probably work fine and I'll never swap them out. But it's my intention to swap them out later. Let's get these things bolted in place. And what I want to know is, why are 12/24 screws so hard to find? I don't understand. Never in my life would I have thought that it was hard to find this size, but apparently it is. Just a little bit long, but that's going to be fine. We got a linear rail. Slides nice. And with this mounted to the side of the table, we can attach the tabletop to these brackets here, and that should let it move up and down. And to attach these to the table, my plan is to bolt them through these holes here, right about in this location. The biggest issue is now I don't have a bar at the bottom to bolt these to. I could drill holes through these mounts for the motor, but I kind of want to keep everything symmetrical from side to side. On the other side, I'm going to have to add one more piece of square tubing right here to bolt the bottom. So I think while I'm adding that, I'm going to add another one here. That'll give me a piece of square tubing at the bottom. I'll use the existing tube at the top. We'll drill some through holes in here, bolt them in on both ends. That means I need to dig out the welder and weld in some more tube. I'm a little hesitant to do that because last time I did some welding, the very next day, we got 3 days straight of heavy snow. Hopefully that doesn't happen this time, but I got to take this thing all back apart, remove the sander. I'm going to take the motor off. We'll take the table back outside, clean off the paint, set everything up for welding, and burn in some more square tubes. Fingers crossed for no snow. Now my weld beads are coming back. It's been a while since I've welded this much. And kind of like everything, if you don't do it very often, you kind of lose your practice. Don't touch it, it's hot. But it's laying down a lot nicer. I can see the heat soaking into the piece on either side. I'm happy with that one. And while I was at it, remember those motor mount pieces that I welded inside the shop during the snowstorm? I'm going to finish welding those now as well. I decided now would be the time to start adding paint to some of these parts. Look at that. I guess I didn't let it cool quite enough. Does that mean this paint is heat baked? Before I can start painting this base, I need to remove this plywood top and then spend a few minutes sanding just to make sure everything comes out nice and smooth. Now it probably would have been better to remove all of this existing red paint, but I figure if I just scuff it up, it's going to come out just fine. That's looking pretty good. I think we'll just let this dry for a little while out here in the wind and hope it doesn't start snowing. Then we can go about getting this thing reassembled. Well, good morning. It's a new day. I've let the paint dry overnight for the base. Should be plenty dry by now. So let's get back into the shop and get back to work. While everything's disassembled and I've got easy access all around this table, I want to get these plates that hold the bearings attached. And this one here, I pulled the bearings back off. That way I'm not trying to handle a big heavy unit. I just have this plate To locate these, I'm going to use some scraps of wood that I can clamp on to the edge of this table. And this will be a stop, so all I have to do is line the plate right up against those scraps of wood. I've got another piece of steel here, which I'll just lay on the top. Now, if I butt the piece up against the pieces of wood and just up against this piece of metal, we'll clamp that in place right there and we can drill the holes. I do still need to put some paint on these plates, but I ran out of paint when I was painting the table. That's all right, we'll be able to do that a little bit later on. And now with this plate clamped in place, I can use a transfer punch, mark the hole location on these rails, and then I'll drill and tap those so that I can bolt these on. I'm not going to drill through holes all the way through this piece because I want the inside to be free of any sort of obstruction. So I'm just going to drill a hole through the outer layer of this steel tube, and then we'll tap that for some bolts. Now I'll tap those holes with a 1/4-20 tap. I gotta put something under this leg. In the first video when I ran this and you saw it wobbling around, that was because the table was not sitting level, allowing it to rock. It wasn't the machine or the belt or anything flopping around. The movement that you saw was because the leg was not sitting level, and it's kind of driving me crazy. Fixed. And now we should be able to just use some bolts and bolt these plates on. I'm using flat washers and lock washers because I don't want anything to vibrate if the machine's running and maybe come loose. I wouldn't want these to drop off. I doubt they would, but with a lock washer, then at least I don't even have to worry about it. Ah, that's not going anywhere. I think that's going to work good. Now I've got to repeat that process for 2 more corners of this table base. My little workshop here is really starting to smell more like a metal shop than more of a wood shop, but you guys know I do all kinds of different projects, and these are the types that I don't really do all that often, but man, when I get the chance to do them, I really enjoy this type of work, figuring out mechanisms and how things need to fit together, and just something I really enjoy doing, and I'm having a good time working on this project. There we go. I've got the 3rd rail mounted. They're all in place. They all move up and down smoothly. Now I'm going to reinstall the original top that was on this table. It's possible that maybe later on down the road I might swap this out, but for now I'm going to roll with this, see how it works. The way this whole thing is going to work is the table is going to be mounted to these rails, and the rails will just allow it to smoothly slide up and down, and it'll provide it some support. The bearings will keep everything in alignment so that it can't rack back and forth or tip and somehow be unstable. What's going to do most of the work is a hand crank that I have that's going to get mounted right in the center. I'm going to be able to crank it up, which will raise the table, crank it back down. So most of the weight is going to be supported by this hand crank. I need to make sure that this tabletop is sturdy enough to support all of the weight. I'm gonna make the table out of wood, so it's not gonna be overly heavy, but by the time you get some of the weight of these rails in there, there is gonna be a little bit of weight. So I wanna make sure this is nice and solid. I've cut a piece of plywood, which is actually a scrap from the table that this sander originally was mounted on. So I'm trying to reuse as many of the pieces that went with this as possible. All this piece is gonna do is gonna get mounted up underneath here, underneath this piece of plywood. I'll glue that in place, and then we'll hold it in place with some screws because it's gonna be hard to clamp. The reason I did not put this on ahead of time is because I wanna make sure the tabletop is right where it goes, and then this fits just inside the rails. So by gluing it on now, it's gonna be positioned exactly where it needs to be. I'm not super concerned with having 100% glue coverage. There's gonna be enough surface area to this panel that it's gonna be plenty strong. Whoa. That should provide plenty of reinforcement to make sure there's no movement in this top. So I got the sander back onto the tabletop. Right now it's still clamped in place, but I think we're at a spot now where I can start taking some measurements as to where these brackets are, and we can start actually working on the work table that's going to support our workpiece. I think this is a good place to stop for now. I got to get this video edited so you guys can check it out. In the next episode, we're going to work on actually building the table. This was quite a bit of work trying to get everything lined up, keeping everything straight and square. Took a little bit longer than I thought. I was hoping to have the table completed, but we're going to get to that in the next one. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the next episode of this build, as well as lots of other builds that I do here at Home Built Workshop. Hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks a lot for following along, and we'll see you next time. That's cool. This thing's going to be heavy.